What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I recently got a sneak peek at an upcoming documentary called Chris Claremont X-Men, which comes out on video on demand on February 6th. This documentary is basically an extended, longer version of a documentary which came out in 2013 from the same filmmaker. Original is called Comics in Focus, Chris Claremont's X-Men. I've never seen the original version, but this new version apparently is much longer and includes a lot more interviews with his collaborators from the mid-70s to the early 90s while he was writing X-Men. Reviewing a documentary like this is very challenging because I have intense personal nostalgia for Claremont's run on the X-Men. One of the first comics I'd ever owned was Uncanny X-Men number 143, which was John Byrne's last issue as an artist. But little did I know that I basically would be sticking with Chris Claremont for the next 10 years until he left the title in the early 90s. So what I'm going to try to do is review the documentary as objectively as possible first, and then toward the latter part of this video, I might have to geek out a little bit about Chris Claremont's career, because this review is a review of the movie, not of Claremont's career writing X-Men. But this movie was directed, produced, and edited by Patrick Meaney, who's done a ton of documentaries about comics. So if you're a comic book fan, we are absolutely in his debt. My favorite film of his that I've seen by far is Grant Morrison, Talking with Gods. Grant Morrison is my favorite living comic writer, and that documentary just did an absolutely brilliant job of summing up his career. But he also made a really good one about Warren Ellis called Warren Ellis Captured Ghosts, which I highly recommend. But what this documentary does really well is call attention to the fact that in the world of comics, particularly when it comes to DC and Marvel and these characters that have been around for a long time, very rarely do you see characters or a title where one writer or one storytelling voice is so closely associated with characters for a long period of time. In the world of creator-owned material, whether it's Savage Dragon or Invincible or whatever the case might be, you often have someone like Eric Larson or Robert Kirkman who will stick with characters for a long time. But when it comes to work for hire, where the writers do not own the characters, it's almost unheard of for a writer to stick with a book from the mid-70s to the early 90s and basically create a golden age for that title that continues to inspire writers and artists and filmmakers to this very day. Here we are in 2018 with a Dark Phoenix movie on its way later on in the fall, which is a story that Chris Claremont wrote way back when. So it's incredible that the movies, as successful as they are, still very much live in Chris Claremont's shadow and are trying to live up to his legacy. So what I really like about this documentary is that for younger readers who might be totally unfamiliar with Claremont's run, it does a really good job of consolidating the entire story in one place. For hardcore fans of Marvel who've been following for years and years, or for comic book historians, for people who have read books like Marvel Comics, The Untold Story by Sean Howe, a writer that I should mention is interviewed extensively in this documentary, there's not necessarily a lot of information in this documentary that'll seem new. Comic book legend Jim Shooter is featured extensively throughout this documentary because he was the editor-in-chief of Marvel while Chris Claremont was doing the bulk of his great X-Men run. And he tells a lot of fascinating anecdotes and a lot of fascinating stories, but if you're a comic book fan, you've probably heard a lot of these stories before. Jim Shooter came to my high school when I was like 17 or 18 and told a lot of the very same stories that are in this documentary. So these stories are very well rehearsed and very well practiced. So if you're a regular comic book convention attendee and if you go to a lot of comic book panels, you probably will know most of the story that is featured in this documentary. But what's great is that for someone who, say, is 15 and is just now discovering comics for the first time, they will be able to get the entire story of Claremont in one place. So from that point of view, it is a great resource that tracks the business of Marvel Comics from the mid-70s to the early 90s, as well as the creative aspect that Chris Claremont brought to the table. So when it comes to my own nitpicky grievances of the movie, I do have some criticisms. On the whole, I did not feel like this one was quite as imaginative and well produced as the documentaries the same filmmaker made about Grant Morrison and Warren Ellis. And perhaps that's due to the fact that this documentary was made in two different stages with like a 5-year gap in between. It definitely feels a little bit more thrown together haphazardly, feels a little bit more amateur. It features this really annoying voiceover narration, which more often than not just belabors the obvious or reiterates what the interview subjects have already just said. If the interview subject has just said something, I don't need the narrator to say the exact same thing with slightly different phrasing. Or even worse, there are times where the narrator offers these sweeping opinions and or judgments about certain periods of comics like the 1960s, where I found myself frequently disagreeing. At one point, they just casually dismissed the 60s as a period of very dated stories. But for people who like Jack Kirby's art style, or who like Neil Adams, or who like Jim Steranko, the 60s is very aptly named as the Silver Age. Luckily, that voiceover narration is featured less and less frequently as the story progresses. But there is one filmmaking flourish that the director brought to the table that I thoroughly enjoyed. Throughout the movie, whenever they're talking about a particular character, whether that's Storm or Wolverine or Dark Phoenix, they have these great cutaways to these incredibly convincing cosplayers with all this gorgeous lighting, basically striking these dramatic poses in full costume. And I actually recognize some of these cosplayers from San Diego Comic-Con and New York Comic-Con. I've been going to both pretty regularly for like the last 7 or 8 years. And some of these cosplayers have become pretty famous in the cosplaying community. So I did like seeing that this documentary wasn't just simply close-ups of pages as well as cutaways to interviews. It actually had some dramatic lighting and some filmmaking involved when it came to showing Dark Phoenix doing her thing. So that I thoroughly enjoyed. So I guess the thing that I like most about this documentary is that it does celebrate the career of Chris Claremont and consolidates it all in one place, because Claremont really did get a bit of a raw deal toward the end of his run on the title of X-Men. Basically, he became a victim of his own success. The book became so popular that it increasingly became kind of the poster child of Marvel. And when Marvel came under new management in the early 90s, you had a lot of guys who basically took his characters and ideas, spread them way too thin across way too many titles, and it got to a point where Chris Claremont couldn't control the creative direction of the book anymore. And at a time of X-Men's greatest success, with 8 million copies of X-Men #1 selling in 1991, he only worked on the book for 2 more issues before he and the X-Men parted ways. So while this documentary might feel a little thin, a little slight, it is a great resource. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I will gladly sit through interviews with his artists and his editors and his collaborators all day talking about their process, and I love reliving some of the major story beats. So I guess I should just say that the documentary is very pleasing, but I just found it to be unexceptional, especially in comparison to some of the director's earlier work. So while I might sound a little critical of the documentary, at the very least it allowed me to relive some of my favorite childhood memories. As I mentioned before, I started following Uncanny X-Men pretty early on in Chris Claremont's run. The Dark Phoenix saga had already happened, but as I got a little older and I started collecting trade paperbacks and Marvel Masterworks, I was able to read the full Chris Claremont run up to the time where I started reading. But what's funny is that looking back now, I didn't even know Chris Claremont's name for years and years. I don't think I even really knew who he was until I was about 18 or 19 years old. I remember in high school, after Chris Claremont had left the book, I found my interest in the X-Men title, and at this point there were about 100 of them, waning pretty substantially. Granted, high school offers a lot of distractions, but I was still reading a lot of other comics. Just my interest in X-Men was dying on the vine, and by the time I got to college, my interest had died entirely. It took me a long time to figure out that the reason my interest waned was because the guy who made the title cool in the 80s was no longer associated with it. And when it comes to certain arcs and standalone issues that I've reread multiple times, I don't know if there's a comic book writer out there who's ever written so many stories that I've felt the urge to revisit again and again. The Dark Phoenix saga, I've probably read more than any other comic book story ever written. If you just start with X-Men 101, where Jean Grey became Phoenix, and follow up through 137, where she finally died as Dark Phoenix, not only do you get to enjoy John Byrne's exquisite art through most of that, as well as Dave Cockrum's, but it really reveals Chris Claremont's unique ability to plant dangling plot threads that he would capitalize on a later date. Louise Simonson, his longtime editor, one of his closest friends, she jokes about how oftentimes Chris Claremont would hit the wall creatively and not know where else to go. And she would basically come up with a list of all the dangling storylines that he'd introduced over the course of his career. And she'd say, well, let's just wrap up one of those dangling threads. And I can remember that as a kid in the 80s, as we got into the Mutant Massacre and the Fall of the Mutants and Inferno. All these little characters and subplots that had been introduced years ahead of time, how they would suddenly start paying these huge dividends. And as a result, this world just became real to me. Not that I thought that the X-Men were real, that Marvel Comics was real, but when you have one consistent storytelling voice for so long, growing and evolving these characters, not only do the characters become more nuanced and more interesting, but they start to feel like your friends and family members. I felt as much emotional attachment to those characters in the 1980s as any characters that I've ever encountered in novels or in cinema. And while a lot of people complain today about event fatigue and crossover fatigue, when Chris Claremont first started doing these X-Men crossovers in the 80s, I enjoyed it to the fullest, because the very first Mutant Massacre X-Men crossover, it gave Chris Claremont and Louise Simonson and Walter Simonson and basically their immediate circle of friends all a chance to play in the same sandbox. So suddenly, Power Pack, New Mutants, Mighty Thor, X-Men, and X-Factor, all these books were basically telling the same story, but it worked. You had friends and collaborators planning it out. So it didn't feel like this weird piecemeal story thrown together from 100 different writers and artists. And as that led into Fall of the Mutants and then eventually Inferno, it was one of the only times where as a kid, I found myself hotly debating with other teenagers and young kids what was going on in comics. I remember at one point, one of my older brother's friends goes, "Dude, I could dog you on Inferno." He was so proud of his knowledge of Inferno and all the different titles he was following and all the different tie-ins that he was ready just to throw down and show off what he felt to be his superior knowledge on that particular storyline. And what was so cool about Claremont's lengthy run is that you have these chapters or these eras that are defined by certain artists that he worked with. I mean, Dave Cockrum was incredible, John Byrne was incredible, but then you have the lesser-known people like Paul Smith and Mark Silvestri, and then eventually the superstar Jim Lee. And each one of these eras has a different flavor, a different feel, a different cast of characters. Chris Claremont was not afraid to have a revolving door through which characters would come in and out of the story. It was just so cool as a kid seeing a character like Havoc, who I loved. I thought he was a total badass, how he could disappear for years and then suddenly come back and be a major part of the team, and having a romantic relationship with Madeline Pryor, who was the clone of the wife of his brother. And it was divine soap opera in so many ways, and I got so immersed in it. And while a lot of people might call attention to this now, it's something that didn't even occur to me at the time, but when it came to representation of women and minorities and different nationalities in the pages of X-Men, the comic was quite groundbreaking. But because this was the only status quo I had ever known, it just seemed totally normal that you could have a team where half the characters were women. In the 60s and 70s, most superhero teams had the one token chick who would be on there, whether it's the Justice League with Wonder Woman, or it's the Fantastic Four, the Invisible Woman, or the Avengers and Wasp. But I can remember during the Mark Silvestri run where you had Psylocke, Dazzler, Rogue, and Storm as the four main girls, and there were just as many girls on the team as there were guys, and it just seemed totally normal at the time. Also, as a young prepubescent male, it didn't hurt that Mark Silvestri knew how to draw women in an incredibly alluring fashion, so I kind of had a crush on each and every single one of those characters. I think it would be a really interesting experiment to do to get a young reader to try to read his run now and see if it would have the same impact. I have no objective distance between me and the material because I just know that material so well. There's so many little arcs, like when they encounter the Brood or the original Days of Future Past, where it's just, you can read them 10, 15, 20 times and have a blast each and every time you do so. And I would like to believe that if somebody were to start at the beginning of Claremont's run and go all the way up to the end of it, they could have an incredibly glorious experience. But because we're basically talking about my life from age like 4 to 15, who's to say if those comics would have the same impact on me now if I were discovering them for the first time? I mean, my childhood and Chris Claremont's run on the X-Men are totally interwoven in a way where I just find them to be inseparable. So if some people see this documentary and it encourages them to go back and revisit some of their favorite storylines and arcs from their childhood, I think mission accomplished. If this documentary helps people discover Chris Claremont for the very first time, mission accomplished. Claremont's getting a little up there in age, and I think there's no harm in calling attention to the fact that what he achieved at Marvel Comics was truly prodigious. I mean, almost never do you have a situation where one creator is so closely associated with a particular title. I mean, obviously Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, they wrote and drew Fantastic Four together for 100 issues, and that's amazing. But with Claremont, it wasn't just X-Men. It was also New Mutants, which allowed someone like Bill Sienkiewicz to come in, and it became almost like an experimental idea factory. And then there were all the various limited series and spin-offs and things like that. I mean, it's one of the things where Chris Claremont was writing so many X-Men related titles that he was spreading himself so thin, it became almost unwieldy and unmanageable. He was informed almost at the last minute that not only was Jean Grey going to be coming back, but she was going to be coming back in a title called X Factor, written by someone who was not himself, and that drove him crazy. Luckily, the book was such an immediate failure that it allowed them to bring in Louise Simonson, Claremont's editor, who was very much in creative sync with Claremont, and then she started writing the book, and then X Factor and X-Men were allowed to work together in a more harmonious fashion creatively. And then it led to one of the all-time greatest reunions in Inferno, where X Factor and X-Men took each other on while the X-Men were basically possessed by demons. It was absolutely killer. So I'm rambling at this point. I'm going to wrap this video up, but I don't think it's an overstatement to say that Chris Claremont basically taught me what storytelling is when it comes to serialized storytelling, when it comes to soap opera and drama and romance and action and death. I consider myself very lucky to have been a child during the great heyday of his run on that title. So it was an absolute blast to see this documentary. Perhaps it could have been a better film, but it remains a fascinating topic. So if the topic is interesting to you, definitely hunt it down online on February 6th. It'll be absolutely worth the couple bucks you sink into it to watch it. But if you found this review to be useful, please consider giving my channel a subscribe and the video a like. That is always very, very helpful. If you want to talk more, give me a shout on Twitter @Colbrax, or you can leave a comment in the comments below, and I'll be back at y'all in the very near future. Talk to y'all soon.